Lawyers of Reddit, what is a detail that your client failed to bring up to you that completely lost you the case? Not mine, but went to court over a ticket. Lady was in front of me for DUI and hit and run. The judge assigns a lawyer for her since she was so shook she quit her job. The judge asked the prosecuting attorney for details on the case. She legit says, "You mean that car I hit while I was intoxicated?" The judge stops, takes his glasses off and says, "Everything is recorded in this courtroom. I told you not to talk to anyone about your case except the attorney that I assigned for you." You could tell he was ready to walk out of the room with the level of stupidity this lady showed. UK, not a lawyer as such, but a planning consultant. Client signed sworn affidavit stating he'd been running a truck park business for over 10 years on a piece of land. After 10 years the use becomes immune from legal action. The counsel checked Google Maps and saw immediately he lied. Had only ran the business for 7 years. He had committed a criminal offense by submitting a false sworn affidavit. Plonker. Sounds like something typical of owners of truck parks, etc. My dad was for many years involved in ensuring these kind of people waste disposal firms etc operate in compliance with environmental law. He had no end of tales about how impossible they were to work with, even when they weren't in the wrong. It's a shady field of business. When I was an intern at court, I was watching a battery trial with another intern. The defendant was asked if he can remember how many people were present when he beat up the other guy. He then points at my fellow intern and says rather loudly, "She was there but she didn't see anything. Don't trust her." Of course she wasn't there and the defendant was found guilty. A defendant was written a cell phone ticket while driving and defended himself. "Your Honor, I was not using a smartphone while driving. I was actually using a flip phone." Guilty. Unfair dismissal case. The client claimed to have been dismissed without reason or following procedure. After we had started the case, it comes out that not only was he given 3 written warnings, but he was also called in for a disciplinary hearing before his dismissal. Don't lie to your lawyer. Similar to a doctor, I feel like not telling your lawyer everything can just hurt you. Not a lawyer, but going to law school. I worked for a defense attorney who did a lot of federal work. One of our cases was with this guy charged with sex trafficking of minors. We met him at the prison to interview him and he swore up and down he had nothing to do with this and that he didn't even know the girls. A month or so later, heaps of evidence from the US Attorney's Office comes in and it's pages of Snapchat messages and texts between him and these girls, video confessions from every co-defendant and victim saying our guy was the ringleader, proof of him checking in out of different motel rooms, etc. We showed him the evidence and he claimed his co-defendants were conspiring against him. He continued to deny everything and wanted to go to trial, but we repeatedly told him that would not be wise because of all the evidence against him. He ended up requesting a new attorney to be appointed, claiming that we were ineffective. To this day my old boss and I reminisce about how difficult this client was when we catch up on the phone. Estate matter. Client neglected to tell me he had 4 children from a previous marriage. Guess who showed up to challenge the will after he died? They lost. But I would have drafted his will differently had I known. Not a lawyer, but a woman I know received several hefty speeding fines. In my country you can go see a magistrate to have the fines reduced if you plead poverty. She heard about this and decided to give it a shot. So she went to court and told the magistrate a sob story about not having enough money. The magistrate heard her out. Then he asked her, "Madam, what type of car do you drive?" She replied in a tiny voice, "A Porsche." TLDR. Client forged the bank statements that her entire wrongful foreclosure case was based on. We had clients who said the bank wrongly foreclosed on their house. The wife provided bank statements. Their checking account was in a different bank than their mortgage, showing that they had made their payments every single month for the past several years. I checked through each one to make sure they all showed payments and looked good. There was also proof that the notice of foreclosure was never actually delivered to them. The bank was baffled. Expert witnesses we talked with confirmed that during the recession, a lot of banks' record keeping had gone to crap, and a wrongful foreclosure could definitely result from that. We got to mediation, and the first thing the bank comes back with was that upon close examination, they had noticed one tiny error on the bank statements. So they were calling off mediation and subpoenaing statements from the bank itself to check against our client's statements. Our clients were P, and so were we. So what if the bank had made a tiny error? The opposing side got the subpoenaed statements a couple weeks later and sent them to us, and I had the joy of comparing them. I quickly noticed that there were differences between the ones from our clients and the subpoenaed ones in the electronic withdrawal section. Our client had used a PDF editor to delete an entry in that section on every statement, add the mortgage payment, and then adjust the totals, carrying them over each month. We approached our clients about it, and we said these look forged. We can drop the case or you can explain what the issue is. The wife said we should probably drop the case. She never confessed to us about forging them, but without a doubt, she had forged them. Her husband had no idea. He actually wasn't on the call where we accused her of the forgery, and he called a few weeks later asking for a case update. That was not fun, telling him his wife had lied to him for the last year and a half. The opposing side said they'd be okay with us dropping the case as long as our clients paid their attorney fees. Our clients were happy to do that. It's actually very lucky the defendant bank didn't try to get them charged criminally. Not a lawyer, but a manager in an unfair dismissal case. One of the shift supervisors caught a call center worker making private phone calls during his shift. All employees sign an agreement that they are not to use office phones for personal calls. She told me what she had heard and we checked the phone records and found he had made over a dozen calls to the same number in the previous week. It was very clear that they were private calls, because they were calls to a gay sex line. Now, the specific number he was calling was totally irrelevant as far as I was concerned. But given the potentially sensitive nature of the calls, I decided that it would be best to call him into the office, with witnesses, discuss what we had found, and issue him with an official warning. I typed up the warning and had it printed out and ready to go. When he came into the office with his chosen witness, I asked him if he was aware of the company's policy on private calls and he said yes. I showed him the phone number he'd been caught dialing and asked him if he recognized it and if he had called it from the office phones. He immediately lost his crap, started yelling, and kicked his chair against the wall, before shouting at everyone that he quit and storming out through the call center, hurling profanities left and right at the top of his lungs. I let my manager and the HR department know what had happened, and got statements from everyone involved, including his witness. 2 days later, he turns up at the office with his solicitor, demanding an immediate meeting with the general manager. His solicitor wanted a big compensation payout, demanded that I be immediately fired, and suggested that he was going to pursue criminal charges against me personally for hate crimes because his client said that I had fired him for being gay. The general manager called me into the meeting and asked me to give my side of the story. I showed the solicitor the signed agreement regarding the private calls policy, the call records which showed all of the calls he had made during his shifts, and the warning I had typed and printed for making personal calls. I pointed out that at no point had the fact that the calls had been to a sex line been the issue, and that his sexuality had nothing at all to do with what had happened. I then pointed out that I had signed statements from 3 witnesses that his client had quit, and not actually been fired, and reminded him again that the company was only going to give him a warning in the first place and had no intention of firing him at all. The solicitor took 2 or 3 deep breaths, apologized to the GM and myself for wasting our time, and specifically to me for the threats of legal action which were not justified in light of the actual evidence, and walked out, literally pulling the client behind him. The cherry on top, 2 weeks later I got a call from another call center I'd worked at previously, looking for a reference for him. It was a simple bond hearing on a bad check case. $5K, so a felony. The biggest issue with these is that the judge just wants to be sure my client will come back for the new court date. I had just been hired the evening before by the client's crying and panicked wife, so I didn't get a chance to talk with him until right before the hearing. That morning I asked if he had ever been in trouble before. He had some minor charges in the past but those had been resolved. He was now in his 40s and said he had been clean. So far, we're golden. Me. Have you ever failed to appear in court before? Client. After some thought, way back in college, I missed one court date because I was stupid, but that was it. Me. Concerned about his pause. Are you sure? Client. Yes. We're good. Economic crime, established in the community, has been out of trouble for years. Only missed one court date. This should work. We get before the judge and I present my case for bond. I go through my notes, present my argument, and the judge is patiently listening to my presentation. When I'm done, judge, so this failure to appear was just because he was an irresponsible college student? Me, yes, Your Honor. He now understands the importance of meeting his obligations with the court, including appearing when required. That was just a youthful mistake. Judge, very well, I understand. Can you explain the other 9 failures to appear that also show up on his record? I went from calm confidence to embarrassment to barely controlled anger to what I hoped was a neutral expression. I looked at the client, and clearly, the now 10 failures to appear were not as surprising to him as they were to me. Since he was pulling off the calm, confident look much better than I was, I turned back to the judge and said, I think he's in a better position to explain those right now. We got through the hearing. The judge was P, I was P, and he was just as calm. Although he was finally able to get bond, he had to borrow money from his family since he had to put down a whole lot more money than he expected. Don't lie to your attorney. Didn't lose the case but caused the judge to lose his crap and for the whole pre-trial to be tossed and restarted from scratch. Was in the jury pool waiting for the jury to be picked when we had a fire alarm go off and we all went outside. Apparently one of the jurors talked to the defendant accidentally because of confusion on leaving the building. Came back next day and started the whole process over again when suddenly a sidebar is called. Turns out the defendant mentioned to his lawyer the guy who was added to the jury at that point was the one he talked to outside during the fire alarm. Judge flips his crap on both the fact the juror talked to the defendant during the mess, and that they didn't just dismiss us outright that day when the fire alarm happened since we had not actually started picking anyone due to the fire alarm. After ranting and raving and watching buckets of spit leave the judge's mouth and hit both lawyers, he comes back, calmly apologizes to all of us and tells us we are dismissed. Outside of that, one of the times I was on the pool, I watched a defendant realize how freaking real it now was and change his plea during jury selection. That also pissed the judge off to no end. That last happened to me when I did jury duty too. She changed to plead guilty after we were selected. I remember looking at the defendant very seriously and thinking, well, she hasn't had a lot of opportunities in her life, but what she did is fricked up. When I was a law student, I interned for a judge. One of the cases we were observing was an illegal lockout case, where this owner of a franchise location for an international cafe company claimed the landlord owner of the right to issue franchises in the US happened to be same guy. Just one day locked him, franchise owner, out. Landlord had claimed the franchise owner was selling unapproved merchandise with the company's logo on it. For 2 days all we're hearing is about these cups the plaintiff allegedly made. Argument was that counterfeit merch violated terms of franchise and lease, which meant terminating both. Finally, the landlord is on the stand. The defense attorney pulls out a shopping bag as he's about to introduce evidence. Me and the other interns are so excited. For 2 days we've been hearing about these freaking cups, and the landlord suddenly can't remember where he got the cups from. In response to one question he says he got them at the cafe. In another he says the corporate office gave it to him. Since he raised doubt about the source of the cups, the judge wouldn't let them in, and we never got to see them. The defense attorney had to sadly put the bag away back into his briefcase. So yeah, lesson learned. Prepare your freaking witnesses, especially when you're trying to introduce critical evidence. Pre-existing medical conditions. We're all going to find out about your prior treatment, moron. Tell your freaking lawyer. A postcard. While I was in law school, I worked in a state AG office, Administrative Appeals Division. Guy was appealing a huge tax bill for unpaid tax on his dairy farm's milk production. His entire defense and claimed basis for appeal was that he had zero notice of the requirements to report production, sale and proceeds. In initial disclosures, pile of discovery was a postcard from the state tax office from when he initially registered to obtain a state tax number. Very smart AAG laid low, sprung it on the guy after he has cemented his position 50 ways to Sunday. Exploded his whole theory, resulting in big judgment. Moral: read your own discovery responses and document production before building your entire theory of the case. One piece of paper can kill your client's position. This lesson has saved my bacon in 27 years of practice for sure. Not a lawyer, Heard about this at a place I volunteer. A guy gets in trouble for illegal dumping by the county. Guy claims that he's been cleaning up other people's litter and he was doing the country's work for them. Then the county brings said litter into evidence and a heap of it is junk mail with guy's name and address on it. Not a lawyer. My parents had a long messy divorce that took 2.5 years in court. My dad claimed that my mother was trying to take 100% of everything based on a settlement offer she sent him. He failed to mention to his lawyers that her initial offer, also sent to his previous lawyers, was a 60/40 split and she only sent that 100% one in response to an equally unreasonable offer from him. As soon as she could prove the initial offer was reasonable, the judge just basically ruled on everything according to that first offer. His lawyers were so angry because they built their entire case around the idea that she was the unreasonable one. I think it was something to do with arguing that she was not sending genuine settlement offers. I'm not sure why. His goal wasn't to win, it was to prolong the battle. But the original offer exposed him in the lie in front of the judge, which made the rest of the process go very quickly. Something opposite but worth telling. Years ago, I assisted an attorney whose client was caught in a drug sting operation. After meticulous review of the discovery info received, the officer who typed the arrest report failed to include that defendant, who was charged with possession of controlled substance. Ever had possession of controlled substance? Guy was out that same day for time already served. Had a work comp case where a client claimed he fell off the side of his truck while putting a tarp over the load and hurt his back. It seemed legit as he was taken to a hospital and they had given him meds. As we were pursuing the case, it turns out the company had a surveillance camera. The injury seemed fishy to the employer, so they looked at the recording. It turns out the idiot had climbed off the side of the truck, then laid down on the ground and started yelling for help. He had made the whole thing up. No wonder employers question work comp injuries. This guy ruined it for the legitimate claims. My parents spent most of my childhood, and were still arguing it years after I'd left home tbh, embroiled in a messy divorce. One of their biggest arguments was about my parentage. My mum claimed that my dad claimed that I wasn't his child, and refused to engage with him until he admitted he was wrong. My dad refused to admit he was wrong and refused to engage with my mum until she apologized. Much later, I found out that those years spent arguing were all down to a typo on a court document which had my date of birth wrong by 10 years, thus having me being born after my dad had a vasectomy. Neither had mentioned the obvious typo to their legal representation, as I guess they thought fighting pointless battles in court for 5+ years was preferable to simply amending one number on a paper document. As an aside, one parent in particular went through multiple solicitors, barristers, insistent that each one had mismanaged the case, and to this day is still convinced that they were a model client who just had bad luck choosing representation. Our client was involved in a lawsuit and we managed to get the opposing party to come to the negotiating table to work out a $20 million settlement. This was great news, because they were suing our client for $50 million. We spent months negotiating the details and drafting the settlement agreement. Finally, everything was ready. The parties were set to fly to our offices on Wednesday to sign the documents. They had to be signed in person and during a particular part of the day so that funds could be wired while the banks in two widely separated time zones were both open. On Tuesday, our client called us and told us the deal was off. Why? Because the loan they were using to pay the settlement hadn't come through. Loan that would have been nice to know. They had deliberately hidden the existence of the loan, even from their own lawyers. Not a lawyer yet, but I clerked for a DA's office throughout law school. Obviously we don't have clients, but I'll never forget this kidnapping case I worked on. It involved two Asian male defendants who were both the same age and looked relatively similar. Witness is on the stand and is asked to identify where the defendant who pushed an Uzi into his face is seated. It's clear the witness is having trouble differentiating the defendants. In a true moment of brilliance, one defendant raises his freaking hand and basically points to himself like, "Right here, bud." Hands down the dumbest crap I'd ever seen. I thought his defense attorney was going to have a brain aneurysm. I have a story for this. I was in trial for domestic violence charges from my wife, now ex, where she claimed I had thrown white paint on my own car and proceeded to beat her up. What really happened was that we were arguing. She was destroying my things and throwing them out the window. I told her I was done, and so she decided to throw rocks at my car. Tried to pick up a rock the size of my head to smash through the windshield. And when that proved too heavy, she grabbed a 1-gallon paint can to throw at my car. As she tried to throw the paint can at my car, I stopped her and tossed the can aside. At which point, she tried to attack me with an ice scraper. At this point I restrained her and sat on top of her until she calmed down. She did. I let her go. She ran to the busted open paint can, scooped up paint with her hands and threw it at my car. She then went back in the house. I went to the front door to ask for my things so I can get the heck out of there. She tried to kick me in the balls, but I caught her foot and held it, telling her to freaking chill. She tugged to get her foot back and ended up hitting her foot on the door frame, which caused a slight cut and bruise. Well, I left and she called the cops saying I was beating her up and such. We go to trial. I defend myself, and she tells her story of the battered wife. That I was beating her up, threw paint at my own car, and that I slammed her foot in the door frame. At the trial, my lawyer pulls out the pictures of my black car covered in white paint and asks if I really threw paint at my own car. She of course says yes, but then my lawyer pulled out pictures the police station took of her to document her injuries. They were front and side views of her, but you can tell her hands were covered in white paint like gloves. Plus, it came out that she was cheating, which was the original reason we were arguing in the first place. The jury acquitted me, and it was funny that I met the jury foreperson in the elevator as I was leaving the courthouse. She told me, "We decided to let you go because you need a divorce." We decided to let you go because you need a divorce. Well, that's kinda scary. Not that you were innocent. Frickin' A. Story from my dad, who, at the time, was a detective. Guy breaks into a store and steals money and some stuff. The guy's lawyer talks to my dad before the trial. Says they'll be pleading not guilty. Paraphrased. My dad, not guilty? Lawyer, yes. He has an alibi. My dad, did he mention to you that we have CCTV footage of him breaking in and committing the crime? Lawyer, my dad. Lawyer, yeah, we'll be pleading guilty. Client was injured when he slipped on ice in the common parking lot of his multi-family house. Turns out he was the one responsible for clearing the lot. Thanks, buddy. Unfair dismissal case. My client claimed to have been unfairly dismissed from her accounting job due to poor performance. Her story was that they were just racist bullies. It turns out that she was running her own private accounting business, with her own clients, at her employer's premises during working hours, using their facilities. Her argument, when confronted with this fact, was that her clients would never have given her employer their business anyway. I actually did get her a small settlement because they didn't follow proper procedure when firing her, which is why I didn't know about the real reason for firing her. But it was peanuts compared to what she would have deserved if her story wasn't bulls. I was the one being sued for a car accident. I said he ran the red light. He said I did. Went to the deposition and his attorney was asking about his day-to-day activities since the accident. He stated that most days he takes out the trash, watches TV, and smokes crack. Smokes crack. Anyhow, his attorney decided to drop the case for obvious reasons. Never heard another thing about it. 1. Clients lie all the time. 2. Client lies will always be uncovered in relatively early stages of discovery if the lawyers on both sides are doing their jobs at all. I had a client defraud me into taking her case and waste months of my time, only for me to discover that she was lying about everything once the opposing side asked for a bunch of discovery and she refused to provide it and started ducking my calls and making excuses. Not me, but my legal studies teacher who used to be a lawyer was representing a woman suing a supermarket for a slip that caused her to hurt her shoulder. She had to tell the court how much it had impacted life and the fact that she couldn't do her everyday tasks. She said, "I can't even lift my arms like this to hang the washing," and proceeded to show the court the exact gesture in perfect form that she was explaining she couldn't do. That was dumb of her to do in court, but I would believe that she could make the gesture briefly but not over and over again. It's like how some people need wheelchairs for distances but can walk a couple feet. I've got a friend who had their clients leave during recess in court to commit another crime, the same as he was on trial for at the time. She got called to go see him back at the prison when she'd been expecting to see him back in the courtroom. Fired and wrongly accused of sexually harassing her co-workers at a Christmas party. Turns out she doesn't actually remember the Christmas party because she took an Ambien and was drinking. A friend of mine is a lawyer and he said that a client once turned up to court in the actual same outfit he was wearing in the burglary. When the CCTV footage come up in evidence, the client looked down to himself and was like, "Oh crap. I knew today wouldn't be a good day to wear my lucky ski mask." I was involved in a hit and run car accident. My leg was pretty mangled. However, the driver of the car was caught. Turns out he was a rich kid who was driving his mum's convertible Porsche, denied all knowledge of hitting me, etc. At the trial, the prosecutor asked him how long he had been driving, to which he answered, "Do you mean how long have I been driving, legally or illegally?" The judge then went nuts asking why and when he had been driving illegally. His defense team sat down in their chairs and shook their heads. Needless to say, he lost the case. Interestingly, he died a year later by drowning. He had hired speedboat and holiday, flipped it over and drowned. Turns out he was drunk at the time. Karma can be a C. I can picture how the kid thinks he's tough by saying the exact same things to his friends, and that reply just become a habit to him anytime anyone asked about him driving. I primarily represent plaintiffs in personal injuries cases, and oh boy, I have a few. The most memorable was probably during the hearing in this road traffic accident case. Based on all the evidence up to that point, it had seemed like a pretty clear-cut case of my client being cut off by the defendant when he decided to exit the motorway at the last minute. The defendant takes the stand and says that in the aftermath of the accident, my client's friend, who had been her passenger, said to him that she, i.e. my client, was not looking. This friend, who is Polish but has lived here for 10 years, is then giving evidence, and it's put to him that he made this statement. He responds in English that "I don't speak English, so I couldn't have said that." Our barrister just looked at me horrified. I also recently had an employment law gender discrimination case where the whole thing essentially revolved around whether they had told her that her position was being terminated as a result of genuine redundancy, legal, versus whether they terminated it after she got pregnant, obviously illegal. This distinction was emphasized to the client many times, and she strongly maintained that they fired her right after she applied for maternity leave, without giving a reason. We're having a meeting with the client the evening before the hearing, and going through what the defendant will say, etc. We tell her they'll be claiming they told her it was redundancy, and how is she going to respond? She replies with absolutely no hesitation, "Oh yeah, of course, that's exactly what they said." And then there's generally a shocking amount of people who genuinely completely forget what day an accident from which they supposedly sustained drastic injuries from happened on. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.